Hi everyone, you are watching the Chapter 22 through 24 quick review of important plot points. Let's go ahead and get started. So, Chapter 22 takes place right after the trial, and Jem is still very upset with the verdict, so he is having a hard time understanding how, when Tom Robinson was clearly innocent and everyone in the courtroom knew it, how he could be convicted. And Atticus gives us a quote here on page 285 to try to explain this to Jem. Jem says, "How could they do it? How could they? I don't know, but they did it. They've done it before, and they did it tonight, and they'll do it again. And when they do, seems that only children weep." So in this quote, Atticus seems to be suggesting that children are more easily able to identify injustice and that adults have become so desensitized to it that it doesn't bother them anymore. And Harper Lee here, in saying that they'll do it again, suggests that we as readers are supposed to think about injustices that we see every day, that we sometimes either ignore or don't acknowledge, that may have bothered us when we were kids, but that we have moved on from and that we're not bothered by. Now, the day after the trial, we see that the Black community has brought a bunch of food and goods to the Finch household as a thank you to Atticus for doing his best to defend Tom Robinson and to show their gratitude. We also see that throughout Chapter 22, the kids are still trying to deal with what's happened here. And it seems like Jem and Dill are having a really hard time, making sense of the trial because it's a senseless case, right? Tom Robinson should have been found innocent. And we're seeing that the children are losing a little of their innocence here. So Jem makes the comment, and this is on page 288. Jem was staring at his half-eaten cake. "It's like being a caterpillar in a cocoon. That's what it is," he said. "Like something asleep wrapped up in a warm place. I always thought Maycomb folks were the best folks in the world. Least that's what they seemed like." So Jem is feeling like he's really truly seeing the citizens of Maycomb for the first time, and he doesn't like what he sees here. Now, Miss Maudie does try to cheer Jem up by telling him there were some people, just like Atticus, who stood up for Tom Robinson, such as the judge. He should have appointed a brand new public defender, a young guy who didn't really know much, and he appoints Atticus, the most senior public defender they have, who he knew would actually take this case seriously. She also points out that Atticus made the jury think. They were deliberating for hours. And so she's trying to point out to Jem that Maycomb is making small steps in the right direction. However, both Jem and the readers recognize that these small steps aren't enough, and they're not enough to find Tom Robinson innocent of a crime he didn't commit. At the very end of Chapter 22, we find out that Bob Ewell has spat in Atticus's face and that he's threatened to get him, whatever that means. All right, let's go ahead and move on to Chapter 23. So Atticus ends up just kind of joking about the threat that Bob Ewell made and just makes the comment, "I wish Bob Ewell wouldn't chew tobacco." And we see, however, that the kids are pretty frightened by this threat, and they think Atticus should even start carrying a gun, and obviously he refuses to do this. But they are clearly worried about their father's safety, whereas Atticus more so just says, well, he needed to get this anger out somewhere, and I'd rather he threaten and spit at me than, harm his children in any sort of way. Atticus again expresses hope in this chapter that Tom Robinson could get a different verdict once they appeal this case to the higher courts. In Chapter 23, we also find out that Tom Robinson is at a prison, Enfield Prison. It's about 70 miles away, and his family is not allowed to visit. So just imagine how awful that would be. You know you're innocent, you know that the people in the courtroom knew you're innocent, and now you're sent to this prison, and your family can't even visit you. So most likely Tom is finding himself in this pretty hopeless position, even though Atticus keeps saying, wait for the appeal, we still have a chance, we still have a chance. Later in the chapter, we find out that one of the reasons why the jury took so long is one of Mr. Cunningham's cousins actually holds everybody up and is trying to fight for Tom's innocence. Now, this is surprising to us because it was the Cunningham group that came the day that Atticus was sitting outside of the jailhouse and they were intending to kill and murder Tom Robinson. So Jem is just like, how the heck do you go from wanting to kill a guy to then defending him? So we're seeing that maybe some people's minds are changing in this small town. And Scout being Scout makes the comment like, oh, when we start back to school, I'm gonna invite Walter over for dinner and maybe he can stay over sometimes. And Aunt Alexandra gets into this argument with her in which she says, no, you're not going to be hanging out with that boy because he's trash. And again, we see that Aunt Alexandra is pretty classist here, and then we see her prejudice coming across strongly in this scene. After this argument between Aunt Alexandra and Scout, Jem and Scout start talking about the class system, and Jem says, well, he thinks there's 4 groups of people. There's the ordinary people, which he refers to as like the Finches and their neighbors. There's the ones who live in the woods, the poor people, the Cunninghams. Then there's the Yules who live by the dump, and then there's the black community. Now, it's a pretty closed-minded view, and a lot of it is based on wealth and social status, and then also on race. And Scout disagrees with him. She says, no, I think there's one type of folks, just folks, like we're all people. However, Jem says, well, if that's the case, then why can't we all just get along? So clearly this trial has impacted him. He's starting to see how the class system works, and he's getting his own ideas about the class system. And we see he is really downtrodden still about the trial. And he even makes the comment at the very end of the chapter on page 304, I think I'm beginning to understand why Boo Radley stayed shut in the house all this time. It's because he wants to stay inside. So this comment here shows us that Jem is feeling very let down by the Maycomb citizens, and he's starting to see just how cruel the world can be, and it bothers him. And so he's starting to empathize with Boo Radley, like, hey, I get not wanting to be around other people at this point in time. All right, on to chapter 24. We see that the majority of chapter 24 takes place during what's called a missionary tea circle, which is where women would get together to raise money for different missionaries. However, this chapter is meant to really show us the hypocrisy within this town. So we see that this main woman, that's the focus of chapter 24, her name is Mrs. Merriweather. She's talking on and on about how, there's this poor Maroonist tribe and this J. Grimes Everett missionary. He's, helping them out of their sin and squalor. And she's saying all these things and saying how they should help this tribe and help them become Christians. However, she turns around and then says all these nasty, awful things about people in her community. So black members of the Maycomb community. And so we as readers can identify her hypocrisy, but she clearly does not see that within herself. She even makes comments that after Tom Robinson's trial, her maid Sophie was, upset because one of her friends was just convicted of a crime he didn't commit. And she complains about it, says she was thinking of firing her, and then just said like, oh, Jesus Christ never went around complaining. And she thinks she did her maid some good by telling her this, but obviously as readers, we see this more as a threat. So we see the hypocrisy of this woman and of the other women at this missionary tea circle. Another important point to note about this missionary circle is that Scout is trying to figure out how to navigate this world of being a woman and a girl. So we know up until this point she's been kind of a tomboy and she's enjoyed that. But here we see she's actually like attempting to wear a dress and talk to these older women. However, it's interesting because we see how Aunt Alexandra behaves and how she acts like a woman. And then we see a completely different role model in that of Miss Maudie. And Miss Maudie isn't buying into the gossip of these other women. She kind of calls out Mrs. Merriweather when Mrs. Merriweather is talking trash about people in her own community and eventually talking trash about Atticus. So we see that Scout is trying to, navigate this world of women. And she even makes the comment like, I don't think I'll ever fit in or understand this world. Now, partway through this missionary tea circle, we see that Atticus shows up, which is out of the ordinary. He's usually at work at this time, and he asks to speak with Aunt Alexandra and Calpurnia. And Scout and Miss Maudie are there as well. And we come to find out that Tom was shot in prison, and they had claimed that he was trying to escape, and they shot first a warning shot, and then they shot to kill. However, we find out that he was shot 17 times. Which obviously is overkill. They weren't just trying to stop him. There was no way he would have survived them shooting him 17 times. As readers, it would be worth questioning this whole scenario. Remember, Tom really couldn't use his left arm, so to imagine that he was climbing so fast that he almost escaped and that they had to shoot him that many times seems very unlikely. And the fact that nothing is really going to be done about the fact he was shot this many times because he was, in their minds, an escaping prisoner who was guilty of a very serious crime. It just even more so highlights the injustice of this entire situation. When Atticus leaves with Calpurnia to go tell Helen Robinson, Tom's wife, what has happened, we see that the other women have to go in and pretend like nothing's wrong. They don't want the other women in the room to be gossiping about this or anything like that. All right, so that's chapters 22 through 24. If you have any questions, make sure you're reaching out to your teacher. Have a great day.